Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. A couple things before we get in. Number one, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see my fake background and poor lighting. That's because I am on the road for Sagar's bachelor party. The show must go on, of course, but a huge congrats to Sagar that I'm sure you guys all would like to share with him. Also, we're on a slightly delayed schedule this week because of the Memorial Day holiday, but once again, the show must go on. I recorded this episode last week with Stephanie Ternullo. She's a professor at Harvard, and she's written a new book, How the Heartland Went Red, Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalized Politics. This book gets at the core of, I think, one of the most fascinating realignment era conversations. Two questions are basically answered in this book. Number one, why did the Heartland realign away from the Democrats post 1970s? What does that mean then for 2016 and 2024? And of course, this broader question that she gets into the book specifically around whether local forces matter more in national politics than you would actually think. Because what she does in this book is look at three different heartland cities. And actually what she discovers is despite the fact that we kind of think that everything is about national politics and that all of those things that are happening on local directions don't really matter as much, the states that went less to the right and stayed more blue traditionally actually had specific local forces, dynamics, and actors at play in them. So getting at this core question of like how much local politics matters relative to the bigger national narratives is an incredibly important one. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you guys will as well. Lots of good stuff here about unions and the realignment over the past 40 years. Hope you all enjoy this conversation and have a great weekend. We'll be back with the show's regular schedule next week. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Dr. Stephanie Ternullo, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to speak to you. Your book, How the Heartland Went Red, Why Local Forces Matter in an Age of Nationalized Politics, is a really fascinating lens to kind of look at a bunch of different political trends and phenomenons that I think are really interesting. And then I think usefully for our listenership, you're doing a lot of work moving forward on coastal suburbs. And I have like this broader set of thoughts on how important suburbs are to the American political system. Yeah. So I'm excited that we can kind of capture two aspects of this political moment together. Let's start here. Can you just define the heartland, like where, because it's sort of like ambiguous even in terms of the name, like where are we talking about when we just use the word heartland?
Yeah, I'm really talking about what I call post-industrial cities, which are largely concentrated in sort of Midwestern states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Indiana, those kinds of places, but not necessarily geographically constrained to those places. You might be familiar with these kinds of cities in Oregon. We have a couple in California. So they're not only in the Midwest, but they're these kinds of places that sort of developed economically on the back of the sort of manufacturing boom in the United States, which reached its peak in the 1970s. And so ever since then, they've all been dealing with some form of a deindustrial transition, which is often characterized by a shift from that kind of manufacturing work towards more service sector employment. So those kinds of places are the places I'm interested in. And I think they're really politically important because a lot of those places are in these core swing states, are in states that are going to be sort of disproportionately important for the 2024 election, but also probably for the next couple of election cycles. Unless and until sort of the dynamics of where the parties are getting their support shifts.
Yeah, so this is fascinating. Here's what I'd love to kind of hear from you. So I think a lot of us have pretty strong narratives about why different parts of the New Deal coalition broke down and went in different directions. Like obviously like the literature and the political discourse on the South is like a little more complicated than it doesn't like perfectly track. So we could say, hey, it was all a Civil Rights Act, but then why were certain states, like why was, West Virginia voting Democratic into the year 2000? Complicated. But what would you say is like the received like political science narrative of how the industrialized Midwest transitions from part of the New Deal coalition to its ambiguous status today?
Yeah. So I think, I don't want to put words in anyone else's mouth, but I'll tell you my take on the received wisdom. So I think there's sort of three trends, historical trends that I talk about in the book and that I think are really central to this story. The first is the one you just mentioned, which is the civil rights movement. So, of course, the civil rights movement had massive repercussions in the South. It broke down the kind of solidly democratic South that had been democratic since the Civil War, largely because of sort of suppression of the Black vote, right? So the civil rights movement shifts that up, and it opens up white Southerners for the first time to voting for the Republican Party, particularly at the presidential level, not so much locally. But that also had reverberations across the country for other white voters who sort of maybe had more conservative opinions on race, and so that opens them up to the Republican Party as well, right? And then after that, and you can kind of think of that moment as like cross-pressuring. We call it cross-pressuring the white working class,
Mm-hmm.
right? So during the New Deal era, if race can't be this sort of central electoral force because of the suppression of the Black vote, then white working class voters can look at the Democratic Party and look at a party system defined along these class lines and think, okay, that makes sense for me. FDR is for the kind of, quote, man on the street. I'm the man on the street. The Democratic Party is the party for me, right? After the civil rights movement, that changes. So then they can kind of feel like the Republican Party is voicing these racial concerns I have, and the Democratic Party no longer is. And they're kind of voicing these sort of class concerns that I have, right? Although Americans don't talk in class terms. So that's the first thing. And then the next thing is the rise and consolidation of the religious right. So that happens over several decades, probably, maybe starting in 1976 when the Republican Party endorses a constitutional amendment to ban abortion, and then sort of really coalescing maybe in the late 1990s, early 2000s with the Bush campaign and presidency, right? So he's a very different kind of Republican candidate than even his father was.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another moment where sort of those white working class voters, again, who had this sort of commonsensical home in the Democratic Party during the New Deal, it's increasingly less commonsensical, right? Particularly if they're Christians, and particularly if they're, conservative Christians, which is sort of that group of Christianity is growing at this time. And so for that group of voters, if they're worried about these concerns that they think about as moral concerns, there's now a way to map those moral concerns onto politics that there never really was before.
Mm-hmm.
So those are two of the big trends politically. And then, of course, we have this economic trend, which is the trend we just talked about, right? And so that has implications both for people's sort of understanding of themselves as really members of the working class, and also for the decline of organized labor. The decline of organized labor wasn't just caused by deindustrialization. It was also caused by these political attacks on unions, particularly at the state level. But nevertheless, organized labor declines from its peak in the late 1950s. And so that sort of organizational basis, linking those voters to the Democratic Party, linking them to a view of politics in which the Democrats represent them and their kinds of people, that's declining as these other political forces are sort of pulling them towards the Republican Party. So these are sort of kind of massive political and economic transformations. So you can really understand why the politics has shifted.
Something I'm curious about, kind of a bit of pushback here. You said that Americans don't like to talk about class, but I'd actually say it's weirdly, this is like a post-2016 phenomenon. Yeah. Like Americans talk about class, even on the political right, in a way that wasn't very normal. So like when you and I were growing up in the 2000s, the kind of generic conventional wisdom was, if you're talking to a conservative, they'd say, oh, class politics, like that's a European thing. Right. In America, everyone's sort of like broadly middle class, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But post 2016, you see people like Senator Ted Cruz, like my, Texas senator, very much saying like the Republican Party is like the party of the working class. And obviously we'll get into a bit of a discussion on like what class actually means in this context. But I'd just be curious if you could comment then on really the phenomenon. Like I think Senator J.D. Vance and Senator Josh Hawley of Ohio and Missouri, respectively, also engage in that class-based discourse. So I'd just be curious if you could really discuss how you think about class reentering the American political discourse in a weird bipartisan way.
Yeah, sure. So when I said Americans don't really talk about class, I guess I meant two things. So one is that when I interview people. And as you know, for this book, I interviewed about 200 people, a little less than 200 people. And this new project I'm working on, I've interviewed maybe 200, 250 people about politics, right? And I'm very interested in class. And I would say the word class appears very rarely in those conversations, but that people use a different kind of language to think about sort of the broader economic inequalities that they're dealing with, or in some cases that they're benefiting from. So a lot of times people will talk about the experience of just struggling, or they'll talk about the 1% as sort of the boogeyman, or big corporations making it harder for normal people. Like that sort of language, I think, to your point, and I wouldn't just say post 2016, but maybe post 2008. That's just a guess, but that kind of language is really prevalent in these conversations with people because it's prevalent in their everyday lives, right? And I think you and I were talking about this before, but there's also a generational thing going on. So our generation doesn't feel as optimistic about their future as previous generations have. And they don't necessarily feel that they're going to be able to replicate the same level of financial security that their parents had. So there's this sense of like so so talking about that generational divide, is that talking about social class? Well, sure. If we think about social class in terms of wealth accumulation, their parents accumulated tons of wealth in their homes if they lived in particular places, right? But if we think about social class as occupation, a lot of what they're saying is I have the same job as my mom or my dad, but I'm not going to be able to achieve the same level of financial security. Maybe because housing is too expensive, or maybe because my student loan debt has just gone wild. And I never graduated college. So I have all this debt, but I don't have the financial benefits of the college degree. So those kinds of conversations are really sort of omnipresent, but people don't as often use the language of class to describe that really troubling experience of economic inequality. And the feeling that I think there's this widespread feeling that the economic inequality has really hardened, that mobility is just unlikely, particularly amongst folks from our generation that really can look around and say, what it's hard to fathom what would have to change to make them be able to realize the same outcomes as their parents.
Something I'm curious about, could you differentiate post 2008 income inequality discourse and narratives from the deindustrialization 1970s narratives? Because they're actually kind of a little different.
Yeah.
Right. Because my kind of editorial here would be the income inequality narrative basically relates to a bargain that didn't work. So hey, the country deindustrializes, it's the 90s. We have the internet, we have this thing called higher education and college, and that is going to serve as a substitute for the ways that the world has changed. Actually, 2008 and then the subsequent years actually revealed in many different ways that bargain works out for some people, but not for others. But that's different, though, than I think the narrative of someone feeling pissed off about their jobs going away in the 70s and 80s. So can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, for sure. I think I like the way you put that. And I think it's also very, it resonates with the conversation we're having now as a country about our trade relationships, right? So there's sort of, you said the broken promise of the 90s, it's the broken promise of NAFTA, right? Trade was going to increase, trade was going to the rising tide was going to raise all boats, and it turned out it didn't. And so now we're living maybe with the negative consequences of some of that stuff. So I think that there are two separate things. One is that even in sort of, and this is kind of getting into my other research that we said we would talk about at the end, even in these affluent suburbs along the coasts, because of the housing crisis, people feel like they barely scraped into their homes sometimes. And that could be that they could lose their homes if they lost their job. There's this lack of feeling of a social safety net. And part of that feeling comes from, I was saying before, my parents did this. I live in the same town I grew up in, and my parents were a teacher and, a high school principal. And now my wife and I both have to work two jobs were paid 5 times as much to replicate that same lifestyle. And if one of us loses our job, like it's all gone, right? We can't, there's no sort of sense of, so even those people who are benefiting from that economic inequality, right? These are people really at the top of the income and wealth spectrum, still feel like that there's this lack of, there's a precarity, and there's a precarity for their children as well. Like they just scraped in, but how would their children be able to reaccomplish this? So that's, I think whether that's post 2008 or whether that's, I mean, I think a lot of the housing, one of the reasons I think about 2008 is I think a lot of the housing crisis comes from 2008 when we just stopped building. It comes from further back than that because of restrictive zoning and all these things. But 2008 was just like a downturn in building, and we still haven't really recovered from that. And then there is, like you said, this sort of longer term trajectory in the post-industrial cities that I studied in my first book, where you're right. I think a lot of that feeling, that generational gap and feeling, but part of it isn't just that like the jobs aren't as good as what their parents had. That is definitely part of it. Part of it is also the cost of housing and the student loan debt, right? So it's all of these things together. So if you think of these like affluent suburbanites who have that glimpse into a sense of precarity, then imagine what that is like when, you know, you're also unable to pay off your student loans in the foreseeable future, and you don't have the kinds of jobs in the community that were once there, and housing isn't affordable. Like you put all those things together, and that's like a triple whammy. And that's sort of like waves of not just deindustrialization, but kind of economic shifts that have hit those folks in our generation in those kinds of cities really hard.
I want to speak to kind of the central conceit of your book that's actually in the title. So a category of political thought I'm obsessed with are cliches that, no, like interesting points that then turn into cliche that then are sort of invalidated, but then may actually be validated. So you know this, Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. That's like the 1980s. He was, you know, the Democratic Speaker of the House. He had a whole 1980s relationship with Ronald Reagan. He's this like very traditional Boston, not telegenic, not the type of person you'd expect to see in leadership today, but this very, very much this figure of like mid 20th century, like union local politics. At the same time, though, a real narrative that's really dominated the past few years is that actually all politics is local is just a cliche. It's not true. Actually, all politics is nationalized. When you're seeing fights in Texas over school boards and DEI and CRT, that's an example of like national forces coming into effect, like that most local things, your local like elementary school. So narrative in the 2010s is actually everything's national. You're coming in, though, and focusing back on the local reality again and how it determines politics. I'd love to hear how you kind of see your thought and your academic work fitting on this spectrum of which like cliche is an accurate understanding of our political system today.
Right. On the spectrum of two cliches. Where do I fall? So I think there's parts that are right to both of those things. Right. And so in the book, so the nationalization argument is really about one. There's a couple different versions of that. One version of it is about sort of the 2010s, maybe 2000s as well, being a time period after we've had all of these realignments I just described and kind of this social and ideological sorting into the parties. So now you have Democrats who are very similar to other Democrats, both ideologically and in their social position, right? In their sort of level of education, maybe where they live, the kinds of places they live. So you have this sort of very similar set of Democrats, this very similar set of Republicans, and they're increasingly different from each other. This is part of this argument. And so partisanship has become like even more central to their identity and also the lens through which they view the world. And so they're no longer saying, you know, there's fewer Democrats who are willing to say, I'll vote for a Republican for mayor because, you know, I think this person does a really good job of maintaining the road infrastructure. And instead, they're like, I could never vote for a Republican because I hate Republicans. I have this visceral reaction to Republicans. And And so that leads to this kind of nationalization of local politics, right? This infiltration of partisan divisions into these really previously non-partisan or maybe non-political domains. And that could be really troubling, could be really worrisome. What I'm arguing in the book is that actually part of the way we arrive at those partisan attachments in the first place is through the local, is through our lived experiences in our communities. And I think that that argument often resonates with people because when they think about sort of their formative political experiences or these like kernels of ideas that have stuck with them, they think about the way they grew up. And they tell stories about the way they grew up and where they grew up and how that has led them to their partisanship. And so then ultimately those local experiences, once you've formed your partisan attachment, I think some of those other arguments are right? That once you formed your partisan attachment, it shapes these other behaviors. It shapes the way you think about these other things. But I think some of that can be sort of temporary, right? So you can, because of this partisan vitriol, you can, amongst some people who are particularly vitriolic, you can kind of like gin up this anger and this rage over this sort of nationalized issue and put it on this local school board. You can accomplish that, right? Mm-hmm. But then there's a bunch of people, and even some of those angry people who really like, in 3 years, they won't be thinking about that anymore. They'll have moved on. But the core of what makes them a Republican or Democrat, their sense that, Republicans really value Christian morality and biblical principles, or the sense that Democrats really care about people who are struggling and are really doing their best to benefit that sense of that makes them a Democrat or Republican, that will persist. And my argument in the book is that part of that sense comes from where people live. Not all of it, but part of it. And so there's these two sort of countervailing forces. I think both of those cliches have something that's right about them. But I'm just trying to give us a little bit more detail on the ground about how that not just that place matters for people's partisanship, but how it matters, how it creates these sort of durable attachments to one party or the other.
And to speak about the means by which you go about that, you focus on like 3 cities, like 3 specific. Could you talk about the 3 cities, like why you chose those 3 cities and how the slightly different politics in each of those 3 cities like reflects the dynamic you just articulated?
Yeah. So this goes back to the first question you asked me about sort of the breakdown of the industrial Midwest sort of New Deal coalition. So that's kind of where I started from, right? I was really interested in kind of the contemporary ramifications of the breakdown of that New Deal alignment. And that's because I was interested in kind of this moment when in the US, when we came as close to having a sort of class politics as we've ever had, and kind of what happened to that dynamic and how is that shaping politics today. So I identified all these counties that could be considered part of this white working class New Deal coalition. And then I used this clustering method, which groups those counties together based on their similarities in their presidential voting from 1964 to 2016. So I was able to identify groups of counties that had sort of responded differently to the national political dynamics we described. These are places that had once voted the same way. They're very similar demographically, white, blue-collar places, but they've had these different responses to the same set of national politics. And the idea is that by understanding that variation, the local variation that produced those different responses, we can learn something new about the overall trajectory, which is reddening. So of those counties that I identified, only 4% are still voting Democratic today. All of them were part of the New Deal coalition, right? So there is this sort of overall trajectory of reddening. But by looking at these different groups, I wanted to hopefully tell us all something new about why reddening is the overall trajectory. So then I found one place that was part of this group that had turned to the right in the 1960s, right after the racial realignment that we talked about. And then another county and a group that had sort of been like a swing counties. They kind of went back and forth up until 2016 when they really turned hard to the right. And then one county that was among those 4% that had stayed Democratic. And so that's what led me to them.
And what were the local forces in each of those examples?
Sure.
Or I know there's not just like one book. What's like a good like headline takeaway for each of those three?
Sure. So my argument is all about the power of local organizations and the way that they shape problem solving in post-industrial cities, and also the way they shape community identity. Right. And so in that one case that still remains voting Democratic, and not just for president, but at all levels of office, they retain a sort of set of politically mobilized labor unions. So not just unions. One of the sort of swing city that turned to the right, they also have unions. But this town has unions that still endorse candidates for local office. They still canvass. Several of the city councilors during my fieldwork were themselves labor leaders or were endorsed by the local labor movement. And so that means that members of unions in this town, they still think about their economic outcomes as sort of rooted in political outcomes, right? And so they care. The town does a really good job of making this link between what's going on economically and what's going on politically. So politically mobilized unions, hugely important. And in the book, I argue that sort of it's not a coincidence that this one town that still has politically mobilized unions is among this 4% that is still Democratic, right? It's really actually very difficult to maintain that kind of labor movement in the 21st century, given both deindustrialization and decades of political attacks on the labor movement. It's really hard to do that, but it's obviously also very powerful because it's allowed this community to buck this sort of overwhelming trend of similar places moving to the right. This one community has been able to resist that. And then in the town that turned to the right sort of back in the 1960s, my argument is all about churches. And there's kind of two things that we can think of churches doing. One is sort of very well known, and it's kind of the story I already told you about sort of evangelical churches bringing their membership into the Republican Party directly because of concerns about, morality in politics. And there's certainly churches in this town. There have been for decades, churches in this town doing that kind of thing, organizing right to life marches, that sort of thing. But churches are also providing this sort of private but collective social safety net in the community. And so they're sort of visibly jumping in anytime there's a social problem, particularly things like hunger and homelessness. And because there's such high rates of church attendance, everybody knows about it. The local newspaper covers it. The mayor talks about it. So everybody knows that if you have a problem in this town, you go to the churches. And like the local elected officials, they also lean on the churches and the nonprofits. And so it makes people feel like those kinds of problems are local problems, not things that they can resolve locally, privately. And they don't need the federal government. And so they're not like angry at the federal government, but they don't feel they need the federal government to jump in because they feel like they're taking care of themselves. And then the third case.
You're doing an impressive clip of this. This is good. Keep going.
Okay. I feel like these kinds of conversations are always dangerous for people in your position because people in my position love to talk about our research more than any other activity. So
no, good. That's the purpose of it. I mean this seriously because like the kind of objective here is then exposing the work you're doing to an audience that isn't necessarily looking at the Princeton University Press book catalog for this fall. So please keep going.
Yeah. So then in that third case, so we have this one case where politically mobilized unions have done this extraordinary thing and kept this town voting Democratic. We have this other case where churches are doing the thing we already knew about, which is teaching people that Republicans don't like abortion and believe marriage is between a man and a woman, and they'll support those policies. But they're also doing this other thing, providing this kind of community social safety net, which further pushes people into the Republican Party because they feel the Republican Party is going to not force the federal government on them, right? And so these two cases have this very clear sense of these local organizations that are really structuring the way the communities solve problems and think about who they are as places, right? They think of themselves as, either a town that was built on the back of organized labor or a church town, town full of Christians where everybody goes to church, and that's just what you do, and it's expected.
Mm-hmm.
So then I have this third case where, as I said, they were kind of on the 50% line for several decades. And then in 2016 and 2020, they swung hard to the right. So what's going on there? And in that case, I really heard a lot from my interviewees, the same sorts of concerns that you might have heard if you've read Kathy Kramer's work in Wisconsin or Arlie Hochschild's work in Louisiana, this sense, or Jonathan Metzl's work, this sense amongst people of what political scientists call racial resentment, or like a populist racial resentment, an idea that immigrants and people of color are cutting them in line for government services. That's Arlie Hochschild's argument. And so therefore, in that case, people were talking about the federal government as like malignant, making their lives actually actively worse because they're letting these other folks, they're serving other people at this community's expense, right? So how did that happen? And that is what kind of pulled them to the right in 2016, because they have all these right-wing populist candidates in the Republican Party who are really kind of crafting these messages that resonate with people in this town, sort of saying like the small town way of life is under threat by immigration and socialism. Here's how this would happen. Here's how this would affect you. And it would be bad. And so my argument there is that town, partly because of kind of the loss of their largest employer, but also because of other choices they've made, they no longer have the sort of politically mobilized unions or active churches that exist in these other communities, right? So they've experienced not just the industrial decline, but sort of civil society decline as well. And so people feel overwhelmingly like the problems are mounting up in this town, and no one is providing them that coherent way of saying, here's how to diagnose these problems. Here's what it is. This is a case of X, right? In my union town, people say this is a case of economic inequality. The corporations are getting rich on our backs. The Democrats, they will fix this. Here's how the Democrats will fix this. They'll bring in the federal government and they'll redistribute and they'll support unions, and that's why we vote Democrat. And they're diagnosing that problem, right? In this other town, without unions, without churches, no one is diagnosing the problem. No one is giving them any sense of a feasible political solution. And so they're angry and they're sad, and they feel like their town is sort of dying and on the verge of extinction and threatened by these external forces. And the Republican Party has been providing an answer for that.
So I'm going to kind of take you out of your, purely academic analysis setting and just ask you a question about this. Everything you're describing from a diagnosis perspective, I think, is the underlying political logic that has informed the political strategy of the Biden administration. So we are going to very aggressively define ourselves as the most like pro-labor, pro-union Democratic administration since basically the 60s.
Yeah.
We are going to pass the Inflation Reduction Act and really focus on spending money from that act in these red states, deindustrialized places. I was talking to someone who served in the Biden administration, and he said, like, internally, there's a faction that describes themselves as the Trump Democrats, and that they're Democrats who, like, obviously aren't pro-Trump, but they really took 2016 to the chin and said, wow, that's a real signal that we just can't pretend the way we were doing things before then we're okay. And we have to really respond to that dynamic. So in so many ways, the administration's agenda has been in response to these ideas you're describing here. It clearly isn't working at a political level. The policy question, and I think oftentimes these conversations struggle to separate the policy from the political. So it could actually turn out that there is going to be a 2025 to 2029 manufacturing boom in red states via IRA investments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at a political level, the theories that come from the analysis you're describing haven't worked. I'd be curious, since you've actually talked to people on the ground, where you see the disconnect.
Yeah. I love this question. I think about this question a lot, and people ask me this question a lot. So the piece of the Joe Biden industrial policy or whatever you want to call it that I think is the best isn't just investment in domestic manufacturing, but also incentives for companies to basically hire union labor, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that um, the Democrats and Barry Eidlin, who's a sociologist, has written a book about this. Like the Democrats have taken organized labor as a coalition partner for granted for decades, and no one took seriously um, the very concerted attacks that have come from the right to make organizing more difficult in the US for several decades, right? Like we just let that happen as a country. We just let unions disappear. And I think so what I like the most about the Biden policy is that he recognizes that he seems to recognize that is a fatal flaw in both policy and politics, right? Okay, so that's a positive. So I feel really great about those policies. Here's maybe the less optimistic answer, which is that, and I like again that you separated this between politics and policy, right? Policy, great, but it's a long-term response. And I'm not talking 2025 to 2029. I'm talking about 2038, maybe. These investments in organized labor. So I already told you before, I think that people come to their partisanship. They're going to vote with their party. So 90% of Americans are going to vote with their party. So what we really care about is two things. And the margins every election, you want to get those undecided people or you want to mobilize your base. So those are your options in every election, right? Get the undecideds, mobilize the base. But if you're talking about a long-term investment in rebuilding a Democratic coalition, you want to convince more of that 90% pie to think of themselves as Democrats, kind of permanently, right? And so how do you do that? Like I already said, I think it's about their lived experiences. So how do we change our lived experiences? Well, they become members of unions where they have a living wage and a career trajectory and healthcare, and they're not worried about sort of the shift work and the precarity and all of these things that kind of plague the American working class right now. And you remind those unions that they need to be involved in politics, not partisan politics. And this is really, when I make this argument, people, you ask this from the perspective of the Democrats, it's really not a partisan argument. It's about sort of rebuilding a cross-racial working class politics, which could be in the Democratic Party. It could be housed anywhere, right? But the idea is organized labor can do that. It's enormously difficult to accomplish given where we are right now, but it requires a kind of changing the lived experience of the American working class, and unions can do that. Then that's a long-term investment strategy. So to say that someone asked me a couple months ago, what economic message should the Democratic Party have to win back working class voters? They lost not just the white working class in 2020, but they didn't win sort of all over cross-racially the whole working class. They didn't win the majority of votes. What can they do this time? And I was like, I don't know, because I never think about that marginal change. I think about the longer term trajectory of that group of people. And the longer term trajectory can't be changed by Biden's economic rhetoric. You're not going to convince, no matter what Biden says about inflation or unemployment, he's not going to convince people that their lives are good when they're bad. He's not going to convince people who for years have said neither of the parties are making my life better that he has made their life better. You can't just tell someone an argument and overcome their entire life experience. That's just silly. So on the margins, I don't know what Biden can do for that 10%. But long term, I like what he did. He's Scranton Joe.
Yeah. Something I'm curious about, because I think in your articulation of your support for the union policy, you got to actually the central tension here. Earlier, you made a comment about 2008 and not building enough housing. That's obviously a reference to YIMBYism and NIMBYism, and something that the YIMBYs really focus on aggressively are hey, here are ways that regulations or standards or like community expectations at a local level, various like abilities to say no in the process are limiting the construction of housing in a way that like helps incumbents who own houses but don't help people who are rising up.
Yeah.
The reason why this relates to the union question is an underlying tension that hasn't revealed itself politically, but it has revealed itself policy, has been the contradictions between unions as an end of themselves under the various arguments you're articulating here: worker power, community engagement, coalition management, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and broad national objectives that fit within public policy. So the way this is playing out is like in Arizona with the CHIPS Act and the construction of semiconductor fabs.
Yeah.
So obviously, a huge part of the CHIPS Act and just the general push through has been to really tie and bring unions into the process. So on the one hand, from a political perspective and a like even like state of the American worker in response to those people's lived experiences perspective, like that's a good argument. But there have been serious tensions that, like, you know, in fairness, like are sort of complicated because the semiconductor fab companies haven't quite been honest about like what the actual breaknecks have been and where the actual problems have been. But the at least narrative on the ground has been that actually all these union requirements and all these like requirement to have like family friendly daycare options on the actual site have actually impeded the ability just to build chips fabs.
Yeah.
When the actual argument for the semiconductor policy is like, hey, we have a precarious relationship with China. If we don't get our fabs together quickly, we can find ourselves dependent on a really, really dangerous place in the world, while we actually still are right now. So I guess what I'm kind of asking you about is to comment on how does the Democratic Party think about this like difficult balancing act of to what degree do unions actually help us achieve our goals versus to what degree are they a cost we need to bear unrelated to the central objective that's worth it because we have this broader coalition in the Heartland states we need to win.
Yeah.
That's kind of a complicated question, but I'm curious how you think about it.
No, I hear you, because it's also because I've been thinking about housing so much in this new book project. This is also a tension, as you were kind of referring to, within sort of not the Democratic Party, but the YIMBY movement on housing, particularly in California, where unions are really strong. So it would be cheaper to build housing if there weren't. There's several pieces of state legislation in California that require to get sort of density bonuses or to get whatever the zoning release might be to allow you to build more housing and make more money as a developer. You then have to hire union labor, and that, you know, it cuts into the profit, and so maybe some of those developments won't, quote, pencil out, and they won't happen, and we'll have less housing in the long term. So a couple of things. One, I also find myself saying this a lot because I have such enthusiasm for unions. I'm not saying that like every union is perfect, and unions as they are right now are a balm to all of our problems and will solve every issue facing the American worker and also be consistent with Democratic Party policy. I actually think that there's a lot of arguments out there about, as much as I'm railing against, you know, right to work laws in this conversation, there's several arguments out there about how unions have shot themselves in their own foot over the last several decades by not embracing women and people of color into this historically white male organizations, right? And so unions aren't perfect. They've done a lot wrong. And probably the most powerful and entrenched unions are the best at extracting the kinds of agreements that you're talking about with chip manufacturers. Is that what they are? Chip manufacturers.
Yeah. Chip manufacturers. Yeah.
Sorry, okay, I forgot. Yeah, so those unions are going to be really good at that, right? Like the building trade unions have kind of they're one of the private sector unions that has remained. Teachers unions, public sector sector unions are often still pretty strong, and they're good, and they're led by these professional long-term careerist professionals who are very skilled at getting their workers what they're due. But you contrast that as like the farthest spectrum of what unions can get for workers in the US to the version of the world where, like, you know, employees are prevented from working 40 hours a week. And because if they got a full 40-hour a week schedule, the company would, you know, has committed to offering them healthcare benefits And so they have no control over their schedule, which means they can't do anything about childcare. And so they're debating getting a second job to make ends meet, but they can't really get a second job because their schedule is so incoherent. Like
Hmm.
that is sort of the modal experience of the American worker. And I think there's been a lot of great work in sociology in recent years about this sort of this is the precarity that the American worker is experiencing. And so, do I think we need to be like, you know, so there's so much improvement we could make and that unions could make to that experience before like this is sort of the tip, the in your spectrum of cliches, like this is the cliche of unions are terrible and they're sort of a racket and they're all out, they're out for their own benefit and they don't care about their workers. And this is the other cliche of unions as like a real grassroots working class movement. And I think we've seen sort of some signs that workers want that kind of representation, like we saw, in the Amazon warehouse, right?
Hmm.
That was organized outside of an AFL-CIO union. And so I think that kind of representation, it's essential. And again, like I don't work for the Democratic Party. So I don't care necessarily about how the Democrats deal with those tensions on the ground. Um, that's not my priority. When I think about sort of the political or the policy arguments that I make that I can make from my own research, it's that unions have the potential, not all unions, not in their historic forms, but some unions in certain forms have the potential to make the lives of the American worker better. And in doing so, to help make them think about building a working class politics that brings together people on lines of economic inequality rather than sort of separating out white people from people of color and having those white people try to protect their own racial and cultural status vis-a-vis people of color, helping them see that they have something in common. And again, like in our current party system, we might think that working class politics would be housed within the Democratic Party, but that's sort of where I'm agnostic on that.
Yeah, and just thinking out loud here, I'm realizing, listening to your answer, I think part of the answer for unions within the semiconductor chip fab dilemma there is I'm sorry that I can't remember which guest of mine pointed this out, but they just said that their kind of conceptualization of where unions need to fit here is really in the like actually upskilling worker category. So in the sense of because to be fair, like we actually have a couple problems when it comes to those semiconductor chip fabs in Arizona. So there could be like overly onerous like union requirements that are there for political reasons, but there's also just like a skilled labor shortage.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that if unions want to solve both like the membership problem, but also like present themselves not merely as like at best a like ancillary thing you need to have in there to get it done,
Yeah.
but actually be part of the win,
Yeah.
is that unions need to develop the ability to say, hey, government, guess what? You're really struggling to get like skilled workers who could actually build chip fabs and do like that type of skilled labor. We can do that. Like we have a system for that. We like bring in new workers that way. That justifies the dues that people pay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to the labor people who listen and who I've kind of interacted with, I think that the real need to focus on, don't just like articulate like what you're offering like your workers on a like sociological kind of societal back end. Like what are you actually specifically doing as an organization to meet needs that like higher ed or K-12 aren't able to solve? Because that's like an actual problem to solve too.
Well, there's also this weird tension, and now this is so beyond my expertise, so I'll just tell you.
That's why I said thinking out loud. That covers us. We can say anything and no one will judge us.
Okay. So, but there is this weird tension, and this was very, very prevalent during my fieldwork for my first book, which is that sort of we've had this de-industrial transition that I described, this rise of service sector work, but we also have a dearth of skilled labor in sort of a whole range of occupations that are sort of like trade occupations. And, there are like trade schools, community colleges, sort of local economic development directors, regional economic development directors trying to figure out how do we like resolve this supply issue. I don't know what the solution is, but it just seems that in what you're saying, yeah, maybe there's a role for unions there more generally in terms of like trying to update update their image and make them. I'm sure they're involved in all of these conversations already, but like why, given everything I've just talked about, which is that people in our generation are burdened by student loan debt, feel like
Yep.
their futures are insecure, the unions fix that. Like they give you a pathway forward without the student loan debt and they give you a sense of security and protection. um, why is that not more, why are those jobs not being filled? Like, why are those?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. But yeah, maybe something to do with like the cultural value we place on higher education. I'm not sure.
So last two questions here. So
Sure.
you put a lot of focus on um, unions and this idea of like cross racial coalitions. The big phenomenon that I referenced with, Senator Ted Cruz saying the GOP is now the party of the working class, Senator Josh Hawley going to the UAW picket lines. Has there's been a clear effort within certain parts of the right to really like aggressively union brand themselves in a way that I think wouldn't have been true pre 2016. Now, the critical addition I'll add here, though, is that there's a huge difference between getting in a picket line and maybe ticking off some boomer libertarian donor of yours and actually like leading to policy change that actually matters. And I think there are a few too many center left, like New York Times journalists who like go to the fainting couch when they see Josh Hawley in a union line, because like that's not quite the interesting phenomenon here. The actually interesting, like what actually comes from that. So that's a note to you. That's a note to David Leonhardt, just to think about that a little more critically. But that said, how in good faith, because like you said, and I appreciate you saying this, there's entirely a political world in the next 20 or 30 years where there is a role for unions within the Republican Party coalition, like the opportunities there, the rhetoric's there, et cetera. How should we judge whether those Josh Hawley efforts are real and tangible, given your perspective, separate just from like cutesy narratives
Yeah.
about like, because the last thing I'll note here is that like people sort of dunk on Ted Cruz as saying like, he's the party of the working class now. And they're like, what are you talking about? He votes against union stuff. It's like, no, like he's basically saying in a cute way, the diploma divide. He's saying we are the party of the working class because our socio-cultural views don't align with the Harvard faculties. And that's why working class people align with us. He's not really making an economic policy argument.
No.
But how would you judge the economic policy side of that argument?
Well, I think, going back to what I said before, like I think Joe Biden has put his money where his mouth is in terms of calling himself like the most pro-labor president or pro-union president, whatever phrase he uses. He's done those things, and they might not pay off in the short term, but I think they could pay off in the long term. I don't think that the voting record of the Republican Party suggests that they care about the kinds of policies that would benefit most people, not just the working class, right? Economically, I mean, most people. So it's really hard to imagine sort of, I think one of the tensions that people really struggle with in contemporary politics, and I know you've had other conversations about this on the podcast, but this tension that you just mentioned about the diploma divide, like this idea that the Republican Party has this rhetoric that resonates with members of the working class, and yet they use that power to sort of continue to roll back like any semblance of redistributive efforts we have, either through tax cuts or cuts to social spending. And so there's this really deep tension there, but I don't see the Republican, like it seems unlikely. What is a Republican who really believes that economic inequality is a foundational problem and has to be redressed through more than just like free market liberalism? Does that Republican exist? Like that is what it would take, right?
Mm-hmm.
Certainly there are Republicans who say economic inequality is a problem, but often they'll say, we just need more of the market. We just need less government, more market, and we'll fix that. Could a Republican, are there Republicans out there who think differently about that? Maybe. I don't know them. But I also don't study Congress. So maybe that faction is emerging in Congress, but I don't think it's Ted Cruz. I don't know if that answers your question, but
No, because because once again, like you're just being very precise here of judge it by the legislation. And I like what your metric is. Like, look, okay, you stood at the picket line, you say the narrative, but like we should judge the first Trump presidency badly because the result of all these, the heartland left behind was the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in May of 2017.
yeah,
And I think we could judge Biden on this count appropriately from a pure like who's more pro-labor, NLRB,
yeah,
CHIPS Act, IRA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you're basically just saying like, look, narratives aside, values aside, look at the actual policy output rather than just like the narrative. Because like the awkward, and this is the Biden administration's political failure though, what they have not found a way to do. And I think that like this is where the diploma divide matters. I think just at a pure like aesthetic and vibes level, Donald Trump is just so much better at conveying the sense in these communities that he's the pro manufacturing pro. I was talking to someone. There was this Joshua Green from Bloomberg did this like great reporting story, how he went to like outer Pittsburgh where there was this whole like new clean tech factory that was being set up purely by the IRA, like entirely the Bidenomics like story. And he's talking to everyone on the ground, and he said that people just literally refused to believe that this was a Biden narrative thing. Yeah, they just were, even the mayor, like the black mayor of this town was sort of like, look, like, come on, man, like this or that. So that's the central challenge.
They reintroduced some political science to our thinking out loud here. So, but were those people Republicans, right? So this is my kind of thing that I was telling you before, right? Like once they're Republicans, Biden's rhetoric, Biden's story is not going to filter through like the layer of media and this isn't just Republicans. This is people who are partisans on both sides. It's the media they consume. It's the people they talk to. And it's the sort of like, quote unquote, partisan lens through which they see the world. Like that is a really hard thing for Biden to overcome. And people will sort of back themselves into corners to try to explain why they don't have to credit Biden for something. Like, it's like very unlikely that those people are going to credit Biden for something today. But maybe their nieces and nephews will in 15 years. Like we don't, that's the argument I'm making. Right. And so when I talk about like policy, putting your money where your mouth is, like, I think maybe their nieces and nephews will in 20 years. I don't know what's going to happen in 2024, but I don't think those people are behaving any differently. Like there's sometimes this discourse that like, people in post-industrial cities have some sort of pathology, like Thomas Frank, what's the matter with Kansas? They're behaving in exactly the same way as partisans behave all the time. Like you could tell me that, Donald Trump did X, Y, and Z and it was so great. You could tell any sort of Democrat that story and they would tell you 20 reasons why the policies that he implemented were actually terrible, even if they're like factually sort of backing themselves into a corner. Like we all do that. And so we can't we can't suggest that there's some kind of pathology to a particular group for doing that. Right. All that is to say, it's not that messaging isn't important. Of course it's important. Like it matters for that 10% of undecideds or independents or whatever you want to call them. It matters for those people hugely. And I do think I don't get why people I know don't love Joe Biden, or like, I think his climate and industrial policy is just, really smart and it's achieving a lot of the goals that a lot of people I know seem to articulate, and they don't credit him. So there is surely like if Democrats don't credit him, there's a messaging problem, right? If Republicans don't credit him, doesn't matter. It's irrelevant like for this election. It's just for the long term, still smart policy. For the short term, doesn't matter.
No, that's and I think there are a lot of political operators in 2021, 2022 should have been thinking about this dynamic. If your political strategy from a messaging perspective relies on we could make these red voters in Pittsburgh or Michigan, et cetera, think it's 1984, but like the center left version all over again in only 2 years. That was a very, very, very bad. And I'm kind of being ungenerous here, but there's actually something too that was kind of like the underlying actual political strategy here. So that is an excellent place to end. I really appreciate it too, by the way. We were kind of freestyling for 10 minutes in a very lucid and okay way. But then you were like, but at a core level, I've written a serious book. I have serious expertise
recent thoughts on this topic, we'll close there. So, Stephanie, this is really great, and I really want to have you on for a more suburban-focused conversation once that turns into something more tangible, especially because like we'll be able to talk about what happened in 2024, because I think that's really, that's where I think that's the weird dynamic about this election year, which is as much as we want to focus on like the heartland, it seems to me like the actual political strategy that worked in the midterms, and if Biden wins re-election is going to work, is like suburban voters just really do not like Donald Trump. They do not like anti-abortion policies, and Republicans just overreached in what they thought they could achieve there. So I think that's just like a interesting thing to post up in the future. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having me. Have a great rest of your day.